I want us to jump right into Q&A. We've got about 20 minutes left. So please, if you have questions, type them in and we'll get to as many as we can. And if you could ask them as briefly as you can, just so we can get to them, that would be great. Our first question comes from Siraj. So Siraj, if you'd like to unmute and turn on your video if you'd like, you can ask your question.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for these two really rich presentations. I have a couple of questions for Tanvir. I was really excited by your presentation, and one question I wanted to ask, well, one thing that especially struck me about your presentation was that your conception of Salah as social welfare, as the commonwealth, was distinct from the conception of it that I had coming into your talk, which was Salah as the sort of prayer or worship, a practice of sort of a daily practice of worship. And I'm wondering, are these, do you see these conceptions as separate, or do they overlap in some way? But I mean this question also more than just semantically. I'm also curious if this conception of Salah as social wealth or commonwealth somehow draws upon this other conception of Salah as a kind of lived or daily practice of faith and worship. So that's one question. And then the other question that I wanted to ask was, you know, I think there's this kind of familiar sort of move, right, which is that to say if there are racialized or quote unquote non-modern or pre-modern populations, right, that they can simply be integrated into modernity and integrated into, let's say, like mass market capitalist global society. And I took you to be saying, which I thought was a really exciting move, that actually modernity, that actually racialized or quote unquote pre-modern populations don't need this kind of accession to a European conception of modernity, but actually that we can look to our own histories and traditions for resources to assert our own rich and robust traditions of political struggle and social equality and things of that nature that need not even necessarily be commensurate with these European conceptions of modernity. And so I wondered if that sounds right, if I'm like hearing you correctly on that point. And then I'm also curious if Salah, as you're conceptualizing it as this robust sense of social wealth, if you see it as a concept that interpolates only those identified with Islamic communities, or if it goes beyond those communities as well. Okay.
Thank you so much for these incredible questions, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your own talk later. Yeah, these are fantastic. So I should forefront it this way, that the terms that are being thrown around here, so Salah in the way that I'm using it over here is a word which is spelled in English very similar to the way in which the word for ritual prayer in English is also spelled. There is a one-letter difference which actually renders it into a sort of different word. So in that way, Salah, it has a hard H at the end of it, so like Salah in Arabic. But and the other term that might be somewhat familiar with this root is actually maslahat or maslaha, which is the other way to say kind of the common interest or the public good. So in that sense, conceptually speaking, these two terms are separate, but I do think actually that what you're saying is correct, that there's an interlinking between acts of devotion and piety and this term. So Salah, as it's sort of deployed here in this presentation, is a word which means the common welfare, but it also is dependent upon the possibility for salvation and the necessity to act morally on an individual basis. So in that sense, another root for this word, or another deployment of this sort of term, would be like the just man, the rajul saleh, or a person who is saleh, and that sense of tying together even the possibility for any sense of eschatological salvation and the actions that one undertakes every single day with an eye towards being just towards human beings and God more generally, these are actually very, very closely interlinked. So as to your second question, as to whether or not this conception draws upon on prayer, I think that it does, in the sense of prayer is one of those actions that has a sort of genealogy of resistance in Muslim societies. I do think that prayer is something that has been used and can be examined quite fruitfully as part of a archive of political thought. So in that sense, again, I do think that you're correct in drawing the conclusion. And as to your second question, as to whether you're reading it as me saying we can draw upon a different source, I think it's yes and no, that we should be careful about modernity, and we should actually provincialize the term very carefully and not use it uncritically. And I think that part of the problem is it would be lovely to be able to kind of jump back past the colonial period, but this is now 2-3 centuries in certain parts of the world, even longer in Central Asia. And it's simply not possible to extricate the history of European modernity and advancement from the histories of Muslim societies. So in that sense, I think the real use here is to be able to generate concepts that take into account and take into consideration the pre-colonial past, and to be able to use those to disturb the sort of implicit understandings that we might have of the need for progress, or the need for democracy, the need for this thing and that thing and the other, for modernity, while simultaneously acknowledging the fact that those needs and the discourses which have settled into colonial societies have now been generated with an agency and a creativity by people living under colonial rule. Does that answer your questions, I hope?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Great. Our next question comes in from the Q&A from Professor Adiofir. He says, thank you for 2 great talks. Irina, can Tanvir's concept of Salah help you formulate your critique of consumer democracy? Tanvir, you spoke about leaders and rebels, but not about the state, principality, or city which they share. Is this a coincidence or a reflection of the peculiar conceptual neighborhood from which Salah is drawn?
Thank you so much for that excellent question. I've been thinking about that myself, because I think actually we have a very productive conversation between our 2 talks here, which is also interesting in attention. One being very sort of almost painfully contemporary, and like thinking about sort of how it can be in conversation with older histories. And I think, yes, the concept can be of great use. I mean, if you think about it as the common welfare, it's the question also who gets to decide on what that means. Where is that sort of established as an ideal? Is it sort of being managed from above? Are corporates consumer-oriented interest making those choices of what can appear as a common sort of in being in the public interest or being a common good to all? Or is that something that needs to come from the grassroots and need to be a much larger collective discussion about how to define the terms of the common world, and also what all of us cherish and want to collectively uphold and protect?
And if I can actually just say exactly on that note, that Irina, the presentation you gave is incredibly productive, I think, going the other way as well, that these creations of silences and the technologies that are used in order to actually create the silences and the suppressed spaces whereby something might not show up on the feed, or the archive is shaped in a particular way. Obviously, the technologies that one is speaking about are contingent to the moment, but I think that that's actually an exceedingly valuable thing to think about when it comes to just the historical archive as a whole, right? Like, because that's also the space in which I think that movement that you were talking about right now over, you might be talking about something happening in the 21st century, I might be talking about the 14th, but actually we are talking in the 21st century. There's no hiding that. And that creation is what implicates, I think, those of us who are archivists, and keeps us kind of on our toes about precisely the critique that you were labeling, that you were kind of putting onto the megatech corps and the Facebooks and the Googles of the day, right? So
Yeah, to maybe just quickly jump in here too, I think we're also both talking about imperial power structures and about an imperial information management, because obviously these Western corporations aren't just doing this in the West, but doing this globally and making those choices without input often from local sources.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the export actually of exactly these techniques into the global South in a way which I think would still horrify even the already horrified members of the global North I'm sure that's a whole other set of dissertations, right? Like or projects that one could take on. Should I answer Adi's question at this point?
Yeah, if you would like to.
Yeah, so just very briefly, thank you for the question. I think that speaking about the state here is possible in some ways, because at least for a figure like Sheikh Hassan in his letter, the idea of the principality, or of a dawlat is the word, but the idea of the principality is only possible if the ruler establishes Salah. And the definition of Salah as to like what is to be established in the first place has to be done with the concord of the corporate body of people in the area itself. And then presumably this would actually expand. It's tied into also a phenomenon in the 14th century and much for centuries afterwards, whereby these societies were suffused with what we call Sufi networks, in which a spiritual master would initiate various followers, and their popularity could be rather extreme at the time. So the idea of actually getting the quote unquote votes in this sense, maybe that is an exceedingly poor word for it, but getting the agreement of society as a whole, at least on a theoretical sense, could be presumed for the creation of a state, such as the one that he's talking about. Now, as to whether or not this sort of state exists, it's a completely different story. But at least when it comes to the theoretical construction of a state, the ideal state is one in which these things are preserved, and the state comes into being itself in order to preserve these things, because the state ultimately is not important. The state is actually the vessel that allows salvation in the first place. I hope that answers the question.
Great, and I believe we also have a question from Jeff. Jeff, if you want to jump in.
Tanvir and Irina, thank you for these talks. I think my question builds on the last one to some degree. So I think something that emerged in both of your talks is maybe a tension that arises from the concept of the common or something shared, like democracy. So there's, on the one hand, this idea of unity or consensus, perhaps, and then on the other hand, there's a conflict over who gets to decide sort of what that unity and sharing looks like. And so I wanted to ask, I guess, whether you see this tension within common, and then also whether, I guess I want to suggest that this tension requires a sort of constellation of concepts in order to politicize the common. Irina, you brought up, you shared a quote that invokes the concept of war, that there's a war on perception, on the terrain of perception, and that this strikes me as one sort of political concept that could be in constellation with common, that might politicize it in the way that you both are looking to politicize it. I think there's obviously the risk of repeating the false image of Islam as a somehow inherently bellicose social formation. But I wonder, Tanvir, to what extent you think this idea of the sword or war plays a role in politicizing Salah. And Irina, I wanted to hear more about what you think about this concept of like a politics as war that's informing your politicization of user democracy. So thank you again.
Do you want to go first this time, or should I? Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for that excellent question. And obviously, all of these are extremely important terms to also think for user democracy and the politicization of sort of terrain like information management, but also the terrain of perception. I guess sort of what I'm writing in is a bit of the tradition of sort of agonistic democratic thought, as you know, which is also to sort of value conflict as being central to both consensus finding, but also just the political to emerge, like for democracy to be like a previous event that we had here, like a habit of transformation and something that sort of a democratic society is open to and values. Sort of conflict as an avenue to change. And so if we think about user democracy, the way that I read it, it is a political system that is very invested in the idea of consensus, but often an automated consensus. So one of the quotes I didn't bring in here, but a book by Ali Pariser talks about how, for example, one day in the future, and this is sort of an idealistic utopian vision, we could all carry something like room lighting preferences with us on our phones. And whenever we all get together in the same room, the phones could for us create a consensus between our lighting preferences. So this is not per se like a political question he brings or a political example he brings up, but it shows like a certain orientation towards how do you manage different people's preferences. And what you do is you automate sort of the smallest common denominator. But that's not what politics should be, because what we should do in a conflict about values, we shouldn't just aim for the lowest common denominator or automate those kinds of conflicts out of existence, but we should highlight them and cherish them and celebrate them together as a way of making collective worlds and futures and have these conflicts out in public. And so I see that tension, but I guess what I'm trying to emphasize through this concept is that it's something that the tension that needs to be out in public and that doesn't need to be managed from above for us, but a tension that we all need to argue out together. Yeah.
Actually, thinking exactly on what you just said, Irina, about the lowest common denominator, and one of the comments that I recall Siraj making a little bit earlier, I think that there's a possibility of presuming these categories because of the way that we've framed our talks, right? Like, because I've framed this as something that comes to, within Islamic law, Islamic discourse is a concept that we can, and within the talk itself, someone like Sheikh Hassan talking about Muslim homes and Muslim property and Muslim dogs and so on and so forth, there's a possibility that one could look to these automatic lowest common denominators and do a reading of these concepts based on like, okay, well, this concept is one reserved for those people over there who fall neatly within that category. And I think that, Irina, what you just said is incredibly important in that like, we don't have to read it that way. And actually we can unthink ourselves out of the assumed lowest common denominator in these sorts of cases as well, because that is also a form of like handing over the agency that we might have to formulate the boundaries of a particular concept to an assumed, if in this case not an AI or a set of telephones, but a historiographical tradition, for example, operating much in the same way that you were speaking about when it comes to technology. And I think that it's something that at least when I do these readings, I struggle with it all the time, because there is this weight of just the histories that we have read and imbibed and gorged upon for all these years, in which we're told that, well, just assume that these are the actual boundaries and that like the otherizing process is constantly going on. And that's not necessarily the case, right? Sometimes these categories are being deployed in order to actually make a comment that might be entirely counterintuitive to what we might assume about bellicose folks who pick up swords and who employ violence in that sort of way. To get on exactly that question, Jeff, that you just asked, and I really do appreciate like how gently and sensitively you put this, especially when it comes to the racialized image, anti-Muslim images that we see sometimes. I think absolutely, like one needs to have an operative theory of violence when approaching these sorts of texts and archives, because the violence in and of itself, the moral valence of it comes from whatever context and it's being embedded in. The violence is not good or bad, but in many ways, I think it is necessary. And even within this particular example, like what we have in these letters are Muslim thinkers arguing that you're specifically saying that as political figures, you actually have the authoritative means over violence. Not to sound Bavarian about this, but the political figures are the ones with the swords, and the swords should be with them. But then you have the dervishes responding, like, no, actually, people themselves do have the right, when the authorities breach these certain boundaries, they cross these red lines, people do have the right to violence. That right to violence in here is not within a set of bodies, but within a set of actions. And I think that that's something which we might struggle with right now in presenting in a nuanced way, precisely because of racialized imagery that it surrounds us, but it's still really vital to highlight and talk about.
Great. Thank you guys both for all those answers. We are just about out of time, but we have one more great question in the Q&A that I want to pose for you here, and then we'll pump it into the Slack so we can continue this conversation there. Just to note that this webinar will end at the hour, and we'll have a little break for lunch, go outside, take a walk, join the conversation on Slack, and then don't forget to log back in for our next session at 1 o'clock. The question from Professor Buse is, thank you for the papers. He was also fascinated by the potential relationship between your papers. Tanvir ended his paper by insisting that we should not be approaching Salah in terms of resurrection. That seems really important for Irina's concluding remarks also in terms of the shared responsibility with which we are all tasked. So democracy can't be resurrected from the ruin to which platform capitalism has brought it. He wonders whether you would both like to comment further about how you see your concepts as potentially moving in historical time, as Tanvir said, in your two projects, and what are the best alternatives to resurrection. So invite you to continue that conversation in the Slack. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Tanvir and Irina. That was amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.